words to communicate right now. I'm using intonation, I'm varying my pitch, I'm using stress, I'm using eye contact, I'm using gestures. There are many things going on at the same time that are part of my fluency in English. Yeah? And whether or not we're talking about native speaker fluency is another issue. Yeah? So these are all things we'll have to talk about. But I would like to first move to the idea of we have to expand beyond words and think about fluency in terms of many aspects of the language. We very often forget the tools of language are many. Yeah? They're not just words, they're not just syntax, and they're certainly not just phonemes. Yeah? We tend to teach pronunciation, syntax, and vocabulary. Yeah? But those are only 3 of the tools, and we've got to keep that in mind. Yeah? Even those tools, we tend to define them very narrowly. Yeah? So for pronunciation, for instance, we define it as the phonemes. And we teach our students the phonemes of English. And we have them practice p, b, p, b. And they get them so they can do them perfectly in isolation. And then they turn around and say, I'm going to go barking my car. In perfect Arabic phoneme. Yeah? And so the problem is that we teach them the phonemes, they don't quite get it, we get frustrated, so we teach them the phonemes again. And we go round and round and round and round. Ultimately, it may be not so much the phonemes that are the problem, yeah, because barking does not really bother comprehension. You can get it, yeah. But if they say barking, you may not get it at all, yeah, because of the stress, yeah. So there may be, as Jenkins has said many times in her various writings about EIL, English as an International Language Pronunciation, in the international communication that's so important to most of the speakers of second language learners of English, it may be issues that are not phonemes that we have to tackle that are more important. And so I talk about the suprasegmentals a good deal. And when I'm teaching my students, yes, we cover the phonemes, but I don't stress that. It's much more important for them to understand the stress of the words, the stress of the utterance, and how important the stress is with regard to something called schwa. So understanding that will probably make your students much more fluent with regard to pronunciation than going over the phonemes over and over and over again. Particularly for the students that I have, Chinese speakers, when they speak English, it is always with the same stress on every word. So it does not matter. Phonemes make it very difficult, but that's not the problem. It is boring. It is so chopped like that. It sounds very strange to us, and it's very hard to understand because speakers of English, whether they're native or non-native, depend on stress to get the meaning. The stressed words are the meaningful words, and so forth and so on. So there's much we can learn about the teaching of pronunciation that will help with international English communication in ways that are quite important. Yeah, that's just one of the super segmentals. There's also intonation, of course, to worry about. It is also true that if you're teaching your students to speak, to give presentations, that there are other issues like eye contact, like intonation. Yeah. If I speak like this always at the same, if I keep the pitch at the same level like this, I guarantee that within 10 minutes you will all be asleep. Yeah? Because what I'm doing is actually I'm varying my pitch like this on purpose, and I'm varying the loudness. I go off and back and off and back because it helps to keep you awake and keep you with me. I also use eye contact. I may not actually be looking at you, but if you think I am, then you're more likely to listen, and so forth. So these are also suprasegmentals and proxemics and other issues that we have to deal with in teaching the speaking skill. Yeah? Paralinguistic features are also important, like the gestures, eye contact, and so forth, and we need to consider those as well. With regard to syntax, what can I say? We teach the students the standard English, if you will. Yeah? And unfortunately, nobody speaks the standard English. Yeah? Not natives, not non-natives. If they're fluent, they're actually using a different grammar from the written grammar that we teach. Yeah? And therefore, The students need to understand that. They need to be told, yes, the syntax of speaking is different from the written syntax. You don't need to use complete sentences. In fact, complete sentences are quite awkward in spoken discourse. Yeah. For example, if I speak to a non-native speaker and I say, "You want to go get something to eat?" and they say, "Yes, I would like to go to eat now." You want to go to the snack bar? Yes, I think the snack bar would be a good place to go. It's very, very awkward. They're using complete sentences, they're syntactically correct, and they're completely wrong. Yeah, they're not fluent. And so teaching them simply not to use complete sentences in the oral language, to use fragments and to use them fluently is an important part of fluency, I believe. Yeah. Vocabulary is another issue. In the spoken language, we use a much reduced set of vocabulary. And so we need to tell them that they need to use the simpler words of English, if you will, the high-frequency words, and they will probably serve them much, much better. So there are things about pronunciation, syntax, and vocabulary, as we teach it today, that we could teach better with regard to the oral language if we want our students to become fluent. The suprasegmentals, of course, in pronunciation, the paralinguistic features that they can use, probably to communicate when they can't necessarily find the words. For instance, last night before dinner we were having coffee and the server had the cups and he came up to me to give me coffee and I reached with my left hand and he instructed me with gestures that I should reach with my right hand. Yeah, it was very interesting communication, no words at all. It was all gestures. Yeah, and so the paralinguistic features can be very important, facial expressions and so forth. Yeah. Proxemics is another issue that interferes with communication sometimes. For example, when I was teaching in the Eastern Province, Saudis would come up to me and stand right here. Yeah? And to an American, that is awful. That is a terrible feeling to be too close, especially to a male. Yeah? And then they would take my hand and hold it. They were being friendly. I had to understand this in my head. But in my heart, I was going, ah! Yeah. So proxemics is another issue that interculturally can be very, very important. So when I go up to a Saudi and I talk to them, it may seem to them that I'm being unfriendly because I keep staying back. Or as they move toward me, I move back. You understand? Yeah, so I mean, as a part of communicative fluency, that's also a very important issue, particularly in this context. Yeah. Pragmatics are also a big issue, and there's a whole set of rules of pragmatics that are very important to fluency. Getting pragmatics right can be very, very important to whether or not the communication succeeds or fails. Yeah? So what I'm saying essentially is we have to broaden our concept of the tools that we're giving our students if we want them ever to have a chance of being fluent in oral English. Yeah? I talk about it in terms of big G grammar, and it's gotten even bigger. Because we have to think about it in much broader terms. I've been in the field for almost 4 decades now, and during that time I have seen this issue of the tools, expanding and expanding and expanding and expanding as we become more and more aware of what communication is all about. It is no longer simply vocabulary, grammar, and phonemes. Yeah. Things started to change in the late 70s and into the 80s and 90s when we were talking about reference rules and expression rules. Doneness rules, Del Himes talked about doneness rules, and all of these impinge on the issue of fluency and how we interpret and how we communicate. Yeah? Another issue that's quite important to fluency is the issue of settings. Yeah? Alan Firth was talking yesterday about resourcefulness. Yeah? Well, part of resourcefulness is having the resources. And so that is the tools that I'm talking about. So if we give them the right resources, their chances of being resourceful increase. Yeah? But another part of resourcefulness is the issue of being able to adapt. To be an effective communicator, to be intelligible, you have to be able to adapt to different settings. The communication that's going on between me and you right now is very formal. I'm monitoring very carefully. I'm not making mistakes. Yeah? And I'm pronouncing everything very clearly. But if we're talking in a more casual setting, that's all going to change. It becomes more relaxed. I may start backtracking. I might hesitate. you know, there's all kinds of things that go on. I start to make mistakes, if you will, because I'm not monitoring my communication as much. And in both situations, fluency demands different things. Yeah? And if you have the resources to be fluent, then you can adapt to these different settings. So, I mean, there are so many settings in our lives, and they have to do with where we are and what we're doing in those settings. In educational settings, that's one thing. When I go to the grocery store, that's another thing. When I go to the garage to get my car fixed, that's another terrible situation that I hate, because I'm not fluent in garage English. You know, the mechanic has the upper hand, and I'm in a bad situation. But I'm fluent, so I try my best. Yeah? I use the resources that I have. Other issues that come into play are the social, sexual, and psychological roles. Yeah? And those are very important, particularly with regard to pragmatics, but also with selection of everything else. So the syntax, the phonology, the suprasegmentals, the paralinguistic features, everything changes depending on our roles, our social roles. If I'm talking to somebody I respect, like President Bush, like President Obama, then I'm going to act very, very differently. Yeah? My feet are going to be together, my hands are going to be at my side. I'm not going to make eye contact directly. I'm not going to start the conversation, I'll let him start it. There are many rules that come into play. When I use the syntax, I'm going to use more complex syntax. Yeah? He's going to try to make me relax by using simpler syntax. These are things that are going on purposefully. Yeah? The vocabulary is going to become more Latinate, more formal, but he's going to try to make me relax by using less of that, and all of that's going on in a conversation. Yeah? So our choices of vocabulary, our choices of pronunciation, our choices of syntax, our choices of posture and everything are determined to a great extent by the relationship between the two people in terms of social roles. Yeah? Whether we like it or not. Yeah?
It means that these things are defined by the situation.
Yeah, the situation and the roles of the two people involved. If, on the other hand, I'm talking to a student and I'm the professor, everything changes and goes the other direction. Yeah? And we adjust like that throughout our day. Whether we're speaking our first or our second language, that is part of fluency, yeah? At the highest levels, of course. Yeah? Gender issues are also related like that. They have something to do with both social and psychological roles. Psychological roles sometimes have to do with power, aggression, size, issues like that. So if I'm talking to a big person, I'm going to speak differently, more carefully perhaps, than to a small person. Yeah? And you can see how that might actually be related then to gender roles, because females tend to be smaller persons. And so this gets involved in the sorts of decisions we make with regard to our tools. Yeah? All of this sounds very complex, and it is, of course. And so that's one of the things that we've learned over the last 40 years, is that language is really, really, really complicated. Yeah? And all we can do is give our students the tools and the resourcefulness, if possible, the practice necessary with these various tools to make the adjustments throughout their day. The problem, of course, is that many language learners are being taught one register, one style. They're being taught only the formal English. And so I have had many times in my life, students walk up to me and say, "How do you do?" Which is the most formal and odd sort of communication to me. And they're often very formal, and it's very bothersome because they can't adjust one way or the other. They need to be more flexible. They need to have more resources and resourcefulness with the language. Yeah. And I know that's hard, yeah, but I've learned to do it in French, yeah, and it can be done. If you're taught that, you can learn it. Children learn it, so adults can too, yeah. The bottom line is that students need to learn how to make the correct choices, and that is a very large part of fluency, yeah, using the resources correctly, yeah. I've been talking about fluency only in terms of what it means for oral English, for speaking